Jersey, good to see
Jersey,
some
and
locals.
I think you're dialing in from the Midlands, is that correct?
Yep, good old Leamington Spa win.
Oh, lovely.
Right, we'll see if any more people join, but I think just in the interest of time, we'll sort of kick off from there. So good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for making the time this evening. This is the very first of our Multipotentialite series, and our first speaker tonight is Onai Gwachiwa, who works as a senior customer success manager at Medallia, and who has enjoyed great success as a customer manager over the past 2 years. But prior to pivoting into customer success, Onai served in the British Army for 12 years. She also holds an MSc in Education, Practice and Innovation from the University of Southampton, the Master of Arts in Military and Security Studies from KCL, and a GDL from BPP. Outside of work, she likes to read every genre of fiction under the sun, tries to recreate the personal bests of her youth, and is on a quest to find the best spreads in the Midlands. I had a question about that, but I'll wait until later on this evening. But whether you have found the best spreads in the Midlands. So in today's talk, Onai will cover what multipotentiality means, and how that has played into her personal journey, the lessons that she's learned from the army, and how she's applied that in her corporate career. And we will have time for questions at the end, so please do put them into the chat, or raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question live. So with that being said, Onai, I'll pass over to you if that's okay.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining. I know it's probably been a very long week for you all, but yeah, as per the introduction, I'm Onai, and I'm a senior customer success manager at Medallia. And what I'd like to just start off with, before I just go into my personal journey and my story, is to just go through, multi-potentiality and what it means. So when I look at it, looking at definitions, etc., it's often defined as someone with multiple pursuits. However, I like to describe it in using an older definition of the term, which is someone with many passions. And that's how I see myself, really, is having many passions, whether it's in my hobbies or, as you can see, from many different degrees in what I study and how I go about my life. And I think this is something I've just tried to keep in mind as I've navigated throughout life and throughout my career, and to try to focus on what I love, no matter where I am or what I'm doing. So I'm just going to next just give you a bit of background on myself. So I was born in Zimbabwe many years ago, where it's a lot sunnier than it is in England. And I came to university here in England, and the rest is history as it was. So I studied English literature and creative writing at university, simply because it's what I loved at school, really. And I somehow found myself at the end of the university in the army. That itself is a long story, but involves going into a careers office with no clue as to what I wanted to do with my life, and it being suggested that maybe I look at the Navy, and I said I didn't like swimming all that much, so I would try the army instead. So in the army, I commissioned into what's known as the Education and Training Services branch, which focuses on the learning needs and training of the army. And in that, I was given the opportunity to specialize in languages. And through that, I had many different roles, including leading what we call female engagement teams in Afghanistan. And to explain how those work, around about 2010, after about 9 years in Afghanistan, we realized, instead of having all male infantry units that can only talk to the men, how about getting women who can also talk to women, build relationship, and actually do what we're meant to be doing there, which was help build and grow this community. So I took part in those. I further went back to Afghanistan again and helped design and deliver the training for the Afghan policewomen in Afghanistan, so leading a multinational team. And then subsequently finished my career off looking after officers' education in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I will talk a little bit about my transition, transferable skills, etc. later on. But after 12 years in the army and moving about 12 times in that time, I decided it was time for a bit of stability. So I decided to move into the civilian world, have an ordinary life as it was, and I moved into tech. And in the last 5 years, I've been a customer success manager at Cisco and also done partner success at, please don't hate me, at CrowdStrike, which I know was blamed for something a few weeks ago. I'd left by then. And I also did partner success at Medallia, but now I'm back to customer success management. So that's a little bit about myself, who I am. I love food, I love coffee, I love Nina Simone. Happy to talk a lot more about all of that as well. So for today, what I'm hoping to do is to just talk through to you some of the lessons I've learned along the way from the army with regard to military leadership, that transitioning from the military to the corporate world, some of the lessons I've learned in the corporate world, and looking at that synergy between diverse experiences and multipotentiality, and then concluding with some key takeaways. Because I don't like hearing my own voice for too long, one of the rules we have in customer success is that we should never be the main speakers, is I will have a brief pause halfway through to see if there are any questions that have come in that I can answer there and then, if that's okay. Okay, so diving straight into it really is, I'm going to talk about lessons I learned from the army. So to give you some background, I was very, very young. I was one of the youngest of my cohort when I finished university and went to Sandhurst, which is the officer training. I had no idea what I was doing or what I was getting myself into, to be perfectly honest. And when I say it was one of the most difficult times of my life, it really was. So one of the first lessons I learned from all of that is, no matter where I am and what I'm doing, is to remember who I am and why I'm there, and to keep the eye on the prize, as it were. So Sandhurst is a year long of everything from staying up every day, no sleep for a week, digging trenches, to try and stay awake in lectures. After that, it's always just remember why I was there, what the end goal was, is to eventually commission and to try to make a difference in the world, which is why I joined really. And I think that's one thing I've always tried to take forward with me wherever I am. I know we all have bad days at work as well. Whatever's happening, is to always remind myself why I am there. Is it, because I enjoy the job, I like my team, or is it as simple as, I like my family, I like the life I lead, so it's making sure that we have that roof over our head as well. So just always keeping in mind what that end goal is. So that was lesson number one. Lesson number two, which is tied into lesson number three, is building a community around me and around ourselves. Because as much as we can sometimes think we can make it alone, it's not necessarily the case. I found that what has really taken me through the tough times, especially when I was in the army, brand new, not got a clue what's happening, is to have people I can rely on. So to give some context as to, how this worked for me at the time, is when I first went to Sandhurst, I was only one of 3 or 4 they call military virgins, so people who have absolutely no prior military experience, whose families, haven't been in the military before. So everything was brand new, whereas everyone else around me had been part of, the UOTC, University Officer Cadets. Their families had long-standing military connections. They knew everything there was to know, but I was one of those few people who had no idea what was going on. And I remember getting my first kit list where I didn't even understand what I was being asked to buy or to pack in the first place, and having to rely on, other, potential cadets who had never met, who took their time out of the day to explain to me how this works. And just by relying on other people and forming the community, I was able to actually get some initial grounding, and find out what I had to do and what I had to learn in order to go forward. So we'll all eventually find ourselves in that situation. But for myself, that was one of the early lessons I had to learn, is rely on others, especially in such a brand new environment, and also build a community who you can rely on as you go forward. And some of the women I met early on are still my best friends to this day. Okay, and then the next one, which is tied into that, is people will surprise you in a good way, in a bad way a lot of time, but also in a good way. So I've talked about what it was like at Santa. So I'm going to fast forward to about 10 years later, where I'd gone through the ranks from lieutenant to captain, and I was a major and about to go to what we call staff college, which, to explain it in a very simple way, is school for new majors. Basically, you're taught to be a staff officer. And it is a mystery, but some regiments, some officers know to help each other out, etc. And I remember sitting in my office, just an ordinary day, one day, and another officer, already a major senior to me, walked into the office and said to me, "You don't know who I am. We've never met, but you are one of us." This was a black officer. He was also black, from Zimbabwe as well. So, "You don't know who I am, but we've never met, but I've heard your name. You're one of us. And, two of us taking us to dinner and letting us basically giving you the download on everything that is going to come up, basically prepare you to give you a fighting chance in staff college." Because, again, to give you a bit more context, in the Army Staff College, and your ranking at the end of that 9-month course, as it were, basically determines the rest of your military career, should you continue, really, which is why a lot of other regiments and, people get inside knowledge, really, which I really didn't have a part of. And for me, it was just a surprise, people I'd never met taking the time and the effort and the sheer amount of information that were able to give me over the next few months really helped set me up for success, really, especially when everyone else has had the same prep, etc., given a heads up by their own regiments as well. And in that case, I learned that people will surprise you, even strangers and people you don't know. And this is where I go back to that thing about community, building a community. Sometimes you'll find you've got the community around you, even though you don't know that it's there. Right. And then the last lesson I've got from the Army, I'll also go into military leadership, but just generic from the Army, is you're capable of more than you can imagine. And I definitely found myself surprising myself somewhat throughout my career. Really explained, how when I first joined, I really didn't have a clue, let's be honest, what I was getting myself into. Is a little bit naive, but I grew to surprise myself. An example of this is I mentioned that I did female engagement teams when I was in Afghanistan. But there is a longer story to that, which I'll just show you again about how we can surprise ourselves. Is when I initially was deployed to Afghanistan, I was meant to be working in an army education center in a base that's called Kandahar, which also was the second largest city in Afghanistan. The first thing that went wrong is that the plane landed in the wrong place. So I was several hundred kilometers south of where I was supposed to be. I was told to stay and basically create my own role there. But again, I was surprised myself using skills I had, analyzing what I could bring to there, realizing I had language skills that no one else had, is actually working with people around me, finding that actually I talk to people, I like talking, really, and I could use that to help form and lead a new role, which in that case were female engagement teams in Afghanistan. So in that case, I think that was one of the core lessons I learned about myself, and that I always try to use to push myself sometimes, is you are more than you are. And what I always do is encourage people is push yourself. If you've never tried it before, try it, because you never know what it is that you may actually achieve and where you may succeed. Okay, so that's the first part of the lessons learned. So those are the more generic lessons. Next, I'd like to talk about that leadership element, as it were, because a lot of my military career was focused on military leadership. One, the standard is all about teaching you to be a leader. And after that, being part of the ETS, all about helping and training Army to be leaders as well. So one of the first things I learned from the theory and practicality of it is that there are many, many forms of leadership and leadership theories out there. We used to live by Peter Norton, I think it's called Theory in Leadership, which is a great book. But there's so many theories there, you know, learn about behavioral leadership, situational leadership, etc. There's even toxic leadership. But ultimately, one of the things I learned early on is that I couldn't just take a theory from a book. I ultimately had to be true to myself. And for me, this was what I found really worked for myself is one, learning from those around me, thinking about what I appreciated from my leaders, the people who learned me, but also thinking about who I am as a person and developing my own way of leading from that. So I found I'm more, no, I can't be the person who makes people run away, run around for no reason. I really don't like shouting. My voice gets hoarse very quickly. So I quickly learned that my form of leadership was more in a way of coaching and mentoring, working with my team and making sure that whatever came my way, whatever came their way, they could cope with, really. So it's all about looking introspectively, looking at what I am, who I am, and how I can evolve that into a form of leadership. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson I learned as a leader, and there's always a debate about how well this works and who does the best, is about leadership and serving those who you lead. So at Sandhurst, actually the Sandhurst motto itself is serve to lead, which basically teaches young potential officers who will be officers once they commission, is that it's not about leading. It's not about you answering to your leaders. Ultimately, it's about what you can do as a leader for your team. And in the military, this goes to the very basic level of standing up for your team, for your soldiers, where it needs to be, or young officers, wherever it is you're leading. But how I found that equates in the corporate world is also speaking up for your team, because if you're a leader, you know you'd have had those days where you're given impossible tasks, your team is run rugged, they can't cope as well. It's being that voice, standing up for them and making sure that as a leader, you're working for them and helping them get the inspiration they need in order to carry out their tasks. And linked to that with leadership in the army is that idea of teamwork and trust, really, is working together, because I think wherever you are, whatever role you're in, you'll find is that it fails with the weakest link. You have to be able to trust the person next to you. And I definitely know people, who do whatever it takes to get ahead. But I always go by, by looking at one, if I'm leading a team, one of the things I want to make sure is that my team works well together. They don't have to like each other, because that's never going to happen with people. They don't have to hang out afterwards, but they have to be able to work together and respect each other's work ethic. And I found that this is one thing that has carried very well forward from the military, from the army itself, into the civilian world. And what I always try to do is, wherever I am or wherever team I'm working with, is to try to build that rapport and make sure we understand how everyone works and how we work together very well. I've never seen it anywhere else, but when I was, actually we did this in the army and Cisco had it as well, is if you lead a team, even if you're a team, is doing a personality test. And you can find free ones on the net. I mean, Myers-Briggs is the most one, but Cisco used to stand out. But everyone doing a test, and a lot of those give you a summary on how you work with other people and getting everyone in the team to read those. And I found that gave so much clarity to how to work together with the team. So I remember I had one lieutenant who always used to misconstrue everything I said. I used to question myself, am I not being clear? What is going wrong? But after actually doing that and reading how she communicates and how she understands things, it actually made everything so much easier, so much simpler. So I always find is, that bit of teamwork and trust and understanding each other and how you work together is key to succeeding whatever environment you may be in. Okay. So those are the main lessons I learned about leadership in the army. I'll do a little bit more about leadership in the corporate world later on. But what I'd like to do now is to very quickly pivot to transitioning from the military to the corporate world and some of the lessons I learned there. So as I mentioned, I literally graduated from university in July, in September of 2007. So literally a few months later, with no job at Nando's in between, I found myself at Sandhurst, as an officer. So when I decided to leave after 12 years, it was literally like being 18 years old again, is trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And it was actually quite opening for me because I basically had to take it as would anyone who's starting over from scratch. And there were quite a few good lessons I learned from that. So the first one I'd like to go through was networking, be proactive, and being proactive. So as I mentioned, I had literally no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I thought about becoming a teacher, becoming an accountant. I did a GDL, thought about becoming a lawyer. But ultimately, I found that what helped me decide what I wanted to do post-army was just speaking to people and networking. And this is what I've learned, in the last, I think it's been 5 years since I left the army now, is what really helps a lot is you've got organizations such as Black Young Professionals out there. There's so many other organizations. I know you've got Women in Tech, Girls Who Code, Black Tech Sales Network, is attend networking events and speak to as many people as possible. And that's what I ended up doing. Whilst it didn't help me as such decide what I want to do post-army, it helped me realize which careers perhaps weren't meant for me just by talking to people and getting to know what their roles involved. But ultimately, turns out people learn line. Networking is how you get jobs, to be honest, in today's day and age. And ultimately, that's how I became more aware of the tech sector, customer success, and what was available in that world. So I'll probably say, even if you're looking to get a new job, change roles, etc., is that networking and speaking to people was probably one of the most invaluable things I did at that time. The next lesson I learned was to be open and flexible, as it were. So to be completely honest, I'd never heard of the role of CSM when I thought of joining the army. I didn't know it was a thing. It was still quite new then, but I was approached. I was working with an organization that helps introduce veterans into technology. And they approached me about a role called customer success management. I had to go online to Google it. I still didn't quite understand what it was. I spoke to a few CSMs, still couldn't tell me what it was. But I thought, you know what, the skills they're looking for are similar to the skills I have and what I like doing, so I'm going to go for it. So it's what I've learned really whilst transitioning, and even before that in the army, is be open, be flexible, is always take a look at what's out there. It may not necessarily be what you think you want to do, but always have an open mind and be flexible. And ultimately, after eventually understanding what a CSM does and getting to know a few more people, I found it was actually the role that I wanted, that I'd been looking for. It used the skills that I'd primarily used in the army, which is talking to people, trying to solve problems, really, and basically making sure everyone gets on, which is my primary role. I feel like a counselor sometimes. And another lesson that I learned was to be polite, always. You never know who you're talking to. This was something I was told quite early on when I started networking and looking at jobs, thinking about interviewing, etc. But I remember the one occasion that it actually meant a lot to me, that I actually saw it in progress. So I was, as I mentioned before, I worked with, it's a San Francisco Bay Area based organization that helps veterans get into technology. They also help people of color as well and women. But at the time it was a program in San Francisco, and we went to different offices to find out more about the culture and the people. And I remember there were a group of us, so about 20 of us veterans in this office in the building for the company who did eventually end up working for. And we're being introduced to different people who worked in the company. And I just remember speaking to the one guy who only said he was in support, didn't elaborate a little bit more. I was just like, okay, it's a bit fake, but anyway, you know, he's from Mexico, get a bit of background about himself, what he does, etc. And it was interesting to see, I know it's a problem that, you know, a lot of military, ex-military have, which is if you don't think someone's got drank, you're not necessarily going to talk to them. And I've seen it happen as well when conducting interviews. But I just remember, you know, a few people, you know, worked, you know, just thought, oh, this guy's in support, you know, kind of work, you know, walk away from him, etc., ignore him. I just kind of like, I go, I'm just going to talk to anyone, nothing to gain, nothing to lose, as it were. Anyway, throughout my interview process, I eventually started interviewing with this company, this role. Turned out the guy in support was actually my manager's manager. He was the VP of global support in Cisco. So actually, sorry, I hope you can hear me above motorbike in the background. So he was the VP of the team we were joining in the company, and he had the final say on who was hired and who was not. And he had actually vetoed a lot of people on because of their behavior. So there was a lesson that was very much learned is, I mean, it should make sense to everyone, I'd say, is, you know, they was saying is, don't be an idiot, to put it in a nice way. Always be nice, always be polite, whoever you're talking to, treat everyone as though they're an equal, as it were. Okay, and I've got only 3 more on this one. So the last, actually, I'm going to go to that one last. Another one is always try something new. Failure is not necessarily something bad. So in my kind of like last few years in the army and kind of first year as a civilian, I had my own e-commerce business because I remember I was in the army thinking, what am I going to do with my life? And as usual, I just decided to just go ahead and do something to start an e-commerce business. And the idea behind that was to make a website where you could curate presents for friends, family. So for example, if you know someone's a traveler, you know, there were curated presents, someone's a traveler, someone, you know, who's not like loves the home, you know, interior decor presents for them as well. I mean, ultimately, I didn't have enough time for it and quite a lot of effort. But one of the things I've learned there is failure is not necessarily an option, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We can always try things and fail and give up and say, well, I tried, because I always find at the end of the day, it's better to have tried something than, you know, to never have tried and known whether it could have gone far or not. And ultimately, I learned a lot of lessons. I learned a lot of things myself. I learned a lot of things about running a business as well. It is super complicated. So I always say to people, you know what, you may not have an idea, just try it. It won't necessarily hurt you. And then one of the last lessons I learned was the importance of mentorship, coaching, and also sponsors as well, especially whether it's in the workplace, whether it's people in the community, or people who can give you a good idea of what you're going into. And for myself, it was getting a mentor who wasn't necessarily, who was in tech, Black woman in tech, not necessarily in the role I ultimately went into, but someone who could help me understand what is going on behind me, help me understand the nuances as well. And one of the things I've since learned is the importance of sponsorships as well. People who will open the doors for you within organization. Again, it's something I'd never come across personally in the army, because you get a report, they're anonymous, you know, it's a board that decides. So for me, this idea was very new to learn about sponsors, and again, ties into the idea of networking, getting to know the people around you, the people who work with you, and making a name for yourself. And then the last lesson, transitioning from the army, probably the hardest one for me was know your worth, basically. And it took me a long time to know my worth. I found out my first role outside the army, I was severely underpaid compared to my colleagues. I had to fight to get a pay rise and the promotion that I knew I deserved. But one of the things I learned subsequently was know your worth and be prepared to fight for your worth, really. It was very hard because, again, I came from the army, where if you want to know how much someone earns, all you need to know is how long they've been in that rank, and you can Google it and the information is there. So for me, it was a surprise to come into the corporate world where everything's secretive. I know some companies are trying to be more open, but one of my lessons was learning, you know, not everyone's paid the same. It's significantly worse if you're Black. it's even worse if you're a Black woman as well. So it's knowing my worth and also fighting for that and proving myself every single time. So those were some of the lessons I learned. And before I move on to the corporate world, are there any questions for me so far?
Whilst people are thinking, I'm happy to ask a very quick question if that's okay, Onai. So, I mean, I think there are quite a few lessons that you learned from the army, but I was just curious to know how long did it take before you kind of saw like, oh, actually, these are the lessons that I learned. I imagine when you're in the trenches and having to then go to lectures in Sandhurst, those weren't the lessons that you were thinking of at the time. Um, but I was just curious to know how long did it take you before you were like, aha, right, this is how this experience has helped me.
I think it actually took years, to be honest. And for some of it, it was people pointing it out to me because I think at the time, because you're so entrenched in it, it's more about adapt and grow, move. It's that fast, you're not even thinking about it. So for me to actually look back at it in full took me years. But I think one of the things I learned to understand that you end up doing subconsciously that they teach you is whenever something goes wrong, always think about what can I do better next time, really.
Mhm.
So growing was natural, but to actually think back on those lessons took a lot of time, years, and introspection as to where was I at the beginning, where am I now, and what were the lessons that had inspired those changes.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that's a really good way that's a really good way to frame that, I suppose, as well. And then I suppose I just had a very quick question, which was around, I suppose you spent a significant part of your career in the army, but now you spent also a good chunk of time in tech. And I was wondering, are there any similarities, are there differences between those two industries and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organization. Actually, the two factors here, which is the similarities or differences from an organizational perspective, and then there's the day-to-day roles. So for me, luckily, I picked a role that I think suited a lot of what I did in the army, which was, even though I was training education and training services with female engagement teams, training police women, I spent a lot of time just talking to people, finding where gaps are, really, and looking at problem solving. And I had this number of other roles I had. So for myself, those similarities have carried over, especially as CSM. A lot of it is working with my company, within my company, and within the client's company, seeing what the gaps are, what's going wrong, what's going right. If it's going right, how do we carry that forward? If it's going wrong, where is it going wrong? And then try to work with different teams to, to bring about those changes that are needed. So those similarities. From an organizational level, I've worked from companies that were completely flat. So when I first went to Cisco and Meraki, that was completely flat. It was a shock to me, to be honest, having been used to hierarchy as it were. But then some other companies that I've worked with, mentioned a couple like CrowdStrike, etc. A bit more hierarchical. It's like, okay, so some similarities here as well. Things like skip levels, which put something similar in the army. So there were some similarities. So I think from an organizational level, there may be some differences. But as to the day-to-day job, because I was able to pick, and I'll talk about the transferable skills as well, and some of the how I learned everything in a bit, is I found it carries on quite nicely from what I used to do, and it's that problem solving part of it. And I found a lot of it is looking at the whole problem, looking at what needs to be done, getting moving. But I know a lot of what I brought to the table from my military experience, what I know was one of the first things what the comment and the documentation, because I believe in having everything written down. You have a meeting, you write it down, you send out the notes. There can be no arguments there. So I think a part of that is what's carried over very well.
So it really then goes back to that point that you made earlier, which is around doing that research in terms of what area best suited your skill set and your background, and then taking it into a different role. Obviously, the desired outcomes are different, right? Training women in Afghanistan is very different to dealing with customers who are trying to sort of understand the software and make sure that it works for them and that sort of thing. But the same skill sets remain.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is one of the lessons I learned when I was on Breakline in San Francisco as well, which was when looking at a role, just looking at the skills. Don't look at anything else, looking at the skills only. And then just looking at which of these skills can I do? What of this can I do? And let me now give examples of where I've done this. And that's how I ended up mapping it across. And I find that's probably some of the best advice I've been given when
Mm.
looking at the skills is what can you do, but also ultimately, what do you enjoy doing of all that and looking at it? So strip away everything else in a job role, just look at those skills and then looking at it from that point of view. And I found that's just what's really worked as well when looking at transfer the skills. And I have sometimes got this question before, because I think I explained that I also work with Black Tech Sales Network, which is how do you pick which companies who are going to be open to those transferable skills as well? And as someone who's coming from a completely different career as well, because I know some people are like, oh, grad schemes, like, yeah, I'm in my 30s. How do you pick those companies that are more open to transferable skills? And I've often found that those companies that are more open will have that in either the job description or in the company description as well. They're quite clearly say, because remember the Cisco one said, we don't care if you've got blue hair, if you've been, homemaking for the last 6 years, if you've been military, etc. If you've been a ballet dancer, we don't care about that. We care about the skills. So a lot of companies nowadays, if they are open to looking to a wider pool of candidates, will say that quite frankly. And that's how I found it was the easiest way of looking right. Who'd be more open to the skills that I've got and who actually help me translate that into what they've got in the.
No, that makes perfect sense. I'm conscious there was a final bit that you wanted to cover off before you close off, but I wanted to put it out to the room and ask if anyone had any additional questions for Onai at this stage. If you did, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. No? I mean, I think in that case, we'll probably keep it until the end, but I mean, and I know you wanted to move on to that final point that you wanted to make.
Awesome. Thank you. So the final part really is focusing on corporate world, tech, getting used to be properly a normal human being, as I normally call it, really. And the first part of it, no, we've covered off, which is looking at those transferable skills, but a very large part of it was also the learning. Because as I just think the question, I'm just laughing because many stories are changing jobs. And what is that? That was like, I mean, it goes into learning new skills as well, because as much as I'd like to think I had the transferable skills, let's face it, I'd gone straight from university to the army. I'd not got a clue what it was like to work in a normal office environment. I just remember it's a funny story, one of the first things I had, I think it was my first day at work, asking someone where the ablutions was. To me, ablutions is very clear. I mean, where are the toilets? But apparently it's not a word that people use, because she was very confused and asked me why I was talking about religious cleansing rites. So from the very, I had to learn very quickly to adapt my way of talking, to adapt my vocabulary, but also to look at what was missing is, right, I've got these transferable skills, but what else is missing from what I have? And a lot of that came into the learning. So actually starting to learn from those around me. And I've done this in every job since, is whenever I'm new to a role, I make it a point of learning from my colleagues, first of all, is, shadow, learn from them, ask questions, but also reaching out to the wider organization. So even though, CSM, I'll also reach out to product teams, I'll reach out to sales, I'll reach out to support to also just shadow them. I know sometimes they find it a bit jarring. Why is this person just wants to see my phone calls, but also so I can learn, find out what skills are missing, find out what everyone else is doing well, and what I can learn from that as well. So the learning of new skills has been quite good for me, and a lot of it for me is, joining talks like this, joining communities, organizations, and listening to other people talk and learning from their lessons as well as to, right, what else, what am I missing, and how can I continue to grow? And some of the lessons on this is just looking at, how military leadership is different from corporate leadership, really. So looking at that empathy and communication. Some of it ties in with what it was like in the army. So you can tell people what to do. They have to listen to you, but ultimately a good leader, whether it's in the army or in the corporate world, is one who leads through influence, one who inspires. And this is something I found, worked quite well in both ways. I mean, I did too as a leader as well. I always wanted to be the person who, when I told my team what to do, I wanted them to do it, not because they had to. I wanted them to do it because they wanted to, that because they took pride in their jobs and understood where I was coming from a leader and what I needed them to do as well. So I think that's one of the lessons that's carried across quite well. And I think it's carried across quite well, I think, has been that empathy and communication part of it. I know in the army, depending on what kind of leadership style you have, you don't necessarily have to explain, what you're doing, why you're doing something. But I found, especially as a CSM, working with different teams, and also when I've managed my own teams as well, is a lot of it is understanding my own team, where they're coming from, but also communicating. Why am I asking this for you? What is the reasoning from it before? And what is the objective? What are we looking to achieve from all this? And I found that's been one of the key aspects that's played an even greater role in my career now. And then looking at how all this works with diverse experiences and multipotentiality, I'm just going to wrap up because I want to leave time for questions, really. Is that what I found that my diverse experiences, not just from the military point of view, it's like from my e-commerce business, from like all the other things I've done, run book clubs, etc. It all comes together because I think from all of us, we all have very diverse backgrounds. We've got very different passions. And even though we don't really realize it, a lot of that will feed into our day-to-day lives and may give us perspectives that others may not necessarily have, really, because it's perspectives and experiences to draw that we can draw upon. And how I always look at this is, I know, people say, oh no, diversity is bad, it's not necessarily thing. Example I always give is, I remember being in the army, going to dinner. So it's funny going to dinner. I apologize, anyone's an ex-officer here, but it is true. All the men dress exactly the same. I can literally predict what they'll be wearing, which is, the blue or pink cords, the blue or pink shirt, the Patagonia belt, the brown shoes, etc. And everyone also orders the same food. People who act like that, think like that, aren't going to have a diverse way of thinking as well, which is why you need people from diverse backgrounds with diverse passions who reach out to all aspects of life, really, to make a team or any business succeed, really. And that's how I always look at it, really. This is something we're trying to kind of push when I was in the army as well. So how I always look at it is, this is where, like, my experience, having many passions, as I call it, comes in. And why I always make sure, if I'm on a hiring team as well, making sure we're looking at people who've got diverse passions, diverse backgrounds, we can bring a lot to that team and continue forward. And so that's how I think it all comes together. And it's a very short summary. I think I'm running out of time. But hopefully you've got quite a lot from that. And what I always say is, the things that I found really work for me have been, adaptability, having an open mind, continuous learning, and as I've mentioned before, is relying on the community and the people around you. Okay. All right. I see there are a few questions. How was the change in jobs easy? Oh yeah, that came with those challenges. As I mentioned, I think I briefly touched on this one. For me, it was the communication was the biggest part, and I've already given an example there. I'd found that I had a very specific way of communicating that I had in the army that I thought was clear, not necessarily so. So I had to change the way I communicated with people, whether it's, people I work with, but also people from different countries and different cultures. And I'll give you a very quick example is, I had my first client assigned to me, one of the biggest we had in Europe, and things were going wrong. So I messaged my manager, who was in the US, saying things are going a little bit wrong, which I think is pretty clear, to be honest, but it turns out this is British speak, because he thought it meant things going a little bit wrong, really, otherwise they're under control. So when I eventually spoke to him a day later, because he took his time to get back to me, he knew he was sort of like, we had this discussion, we said, so when you said things were going a little bit wrong, they were going very wrong. Like, yeah, sure, surely that was clear, from what I said. So I do learn to also speak more clearly, not just, taking into consideration different cultural and interpretations. May all speak the same language, but we all interpret things differently as well. So I had to learn that, and I had to learn, sometimes I have to also be nice. I just start emails, just, can you do this? Apparently you're supposed to start, hi, how are you, etc. Small things like that. But ultimately, I think it was easy for me because of the people around me, and I had a great team, other CSMs with me. And how do you balance being a multi-potentialite and staying true to principles, values, and personal brand? It's a very interesting question, actually. I try to remind myself of why I'm there and what the end goal is. Sometimes I find it doesn't work for me, and I have left a job because of that, simply because I didn't think that it allowed me to be who I am, someone who pursues their passions, but also those values didn't really work for me. But for balancing myself, being a multi-potentialite and staying true to my principles, values, and personal brand, is sometimes I know that I do do a lot. Sometimes there's some things I'll have to sacrifice. Is determining what matters most to me at the end of the day. Is it my passions? Is it my principles? Is it my values? Or is it my personal brand? Is which of those really matters to me? And for me, I know it's going to be my principles and values first and foremost, and followed by all my passions and doing everything that makes me me, as it were. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you very much. I think I don't know if we have any more questions, but feel free to either unmute yourselves or just type it into the chat. I think from my perspective, I mean, this is going to be a very basic question, so apologies Onai, but what exactly does a customer success manager do?
It's a very interesting, there's a reason why no one can ever tell you what one. Because the reason I say this, to give you an example, even on my team, and we focused on UKI, it depends on your clients, and what they know, their size, their problems, etc.
Mhm.
Basic level, so my current job, as well, is how I look at it is I'm the advocate, and how I explain to my customers is I'm their advocate. So we basically work with, so signed 5 accounts, they're normally strategic clients globally headquartered in the UK as well. And my role is to basically be an account manager, but without the selling. So I don't sell. I am there to look after the health of that relationship. Are they getting what they want out of our product? How are things going? Are they getting value from this? Are things going right? Are things going wrong? Are we talking to the right people, to the wrong people? And how are we helping them to realize their strategy? So that is my main role. What that looks like on a day-to-day is very different depending on which account I'm talking about, really, and where they are. For some accounts, they're perfectly happy. We talk once every 2 weeks. They've got the strategy aligned. We talk about, where the investment opportunities are. They just want to use us for advice because they're well sorted. For other accounts, they're implementing our product. They're still having issues. So it's working with the product teams, with support teams as well, making sure they've got the latest, making sure the software is up to date, and that also their engineers are talking to our engineers, and that there's no miscommunication. That's a very broad summary. It will change from company to company, from account to account, as it were. But I hope that gives a general perspective on how it all works together.
No, it does make sense. And as you say, the name itself could mean anything. So I think that's like quite a good way of describing it. So I would imagine there is a lot of that leading through influence, having to manage different personalities as well in the room and get everyone towards an ideal outcome, right? That everyone is satisfied with. I'm not sure if anyone else has put any other questions, but I think whilst you're thinking of some questions, I think a quick one from me was just around you talked a bit earlier about knowing your worth, right? And I imagine that also helped you to sort of initially decide, okay, what are the transferable skills that I want to play up in the interviews? How do I then sort of start to position myself and start to go for start to network, start to reach out to people, start to ask for mentorship and that sort of thing. And I would be curious to know how you sort of developed this knowledge around your worth, especially as you were moving into a completely new role where you didn't necessarily have the contacts, you didn't have the network and that sort of thing.
So I was just I don't know what you'd call it, rude proactive. But one of the things I learned, so I did two things. So I'd attend events, whether it's women in tech or women, things like this, and I'd
Mhm.
just reach out on LinkedIn and say, hello, I heard you speak. I'm very interested. This is who I am, etc. Short, sharp to the point. I'd just like to learn more from you about how you navigated the career. Just ask for 15 minutes.
Mhm.
And what I found is people already said no. So
Mhm.
that's how I was doing it really, is just speaking to people. And when it came to getting a mentor, especially when I started finding out, hang on, I'm being paid much less than everyone else, is again, it was a senior leader when I was at Cisco, so I've been a few calls. And again, it was just reaching out is like, hello, this is where I am, this is what I do in the company, this is my background. I know you may not have time to be a mentor, but I'd appreciate, just having 30 minutes with you, which turned into another 30 minutes the next month. We turned into her saying like, oh, hang on, let me know, tell me about your job role and what level you think you're at and what you're being paid, and then actually coaching me and saying, I know. And she was one of the first people to put it to me like, I think you're the wrong level. So a lot of it is just, talking to people sometimes. I know it takes a lot. It took me a lot to be able to like, how do I just reach out to someone, in LinkedIn? And after going to, just be very polite, don't demand time,
Mhm. Mhm.
be very polite, ask for 15 to 30 minutes, have a very clear ask. And I found that people seldom said no. People always, mostly, made the time really to help out. And that's how I started getting around that.
Mhm. No, that really
I was just
helpful.
going to build on your question in terms of you see how you said knowing your worth was a part of the networking and perhaps like navigating that pay rise because you knew that you're being underpaid compared to your peers. And I just wondered, I'm sure like people on the call have maybe been in a similar situation, and it can be quite a difficult conversation when it's talking about pay and salaries, and how do you navigate those difficult situations whilst you want to be assertive, but you don't want to be rude, you don't want to kind of go the wrong way around it. And I just wondered your experience of navigating that pay rise.
So what I did is I took the job description for the job and level I thought I should be at, and basically built a spreadsheet and basically detailed every single example of how I'd met those requirements and built a business case, sent it to my manager and his manager. And that's how I did it. But it was clear evidence. This is what you require. I've done A, B, C, D, and E for this. This is what you require. This is what I've done. This is what you require. This is what I've done. This is what, and had that frank conversation is, if there's anything I'm missing, let me know and let's talk about how I can start plugging those gaps. And just having that frank conversation. And another thing a friend told me as well when I was looking is to, when you're looking at a pay rise, and you may already know this, is that just don't look at the base salary. There are lots of other things. It can be the stocks as well. It can be different bonuses that come at different times. It can be a car allowance that I found like £700 a month for a car. Anyway, it's look at look at the different pots there. So keep that conversation open. Just don't leave it at base salary. Keep it open, because whilst the money may not be there for that, base salary, right, it may be there from different pots along the way.
That makes perfect sense.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question. We've had something come in from up here. And essentially, you talked earlier about asking questions as a way of learning and plugging those initial gaps that you had when you first transferred. However, you know, whilst people sometimes say like, oh, there are no silly questions, sometimes you find actually people do see certain questions as silly. So how do you know how to ask the right questions?
Okay, so I'd say I'm going to kind of answer them in two parts. I'll say, if you think you've got a silly question, but you don't ask it, find someone you trust and ask them. So I had my two other CSMs at work who I asked the most ridiculous questions, as it were, which they answered, so silly questions. But asking the right questions themselves, again, run it by someone if you're not sure on what the right question is. But I hate to say it because it's not supposed to be the go-to, but nowadays we've got Chat GPT as well. And I found myself doing that as well sometimes. If I'm gonna call, like, I'm gonna ask this question, but like, hey, Chat GPT, how do I phrase this question? Again, that's not the kind of answer I can only give now. But to be honest, for me, when it comes to asking the right questions, I found that actually really helped me a lot. You won't ask the exact same question, but it'll give you a good idea on what question you need to be asked and how you need to be phrasing it as well. So if you can't find someone you can trust to give you guidance on that one, yeah, ChatGPT, it does actually work. I hope it helps.
No, that is really helpful. I love, if in doubt, ask ChatGPT. I think that's a new motto, at least, of like 2024.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think we are at time now. So thank you very much, Onai, for your time and for what has been an incredibly interesting and insightful talk. I know that you share some slides to accompany this chat, and if anyone wanted those slides, please do let us know in the chat below, and we'll send it over to you. Before we close off for the evening, we just wanted to run a quick poll. We're quite keen to run more of these sessions going forward. And we'd really love to get your feedback. So if you wouldn't mind running that poll now, Amy. And we'll give everyone, if you wouldn't mind answering, we'll give everyone about 30 seconds or so. Okay, I think we've got a few people. Give it another 30 seconds or so. I'm conscious everyone has to drop off soon. I think we've had 4. I think we've got, give it another 10 seconds or so. I think we have quite a few people, about 60% of people who have voted so far. I think we can end the poll there.
Thank you.
But I'm glad to see that most of you found it quite helpful and quite useful as well. But anyway, once again, thank you very much for your time. Really helpful. And yeah, have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you once again for making it out on a Thursday evening. Conscious everyone's had a very long week.
Thank you.
And thank you again, Onai, for your time. It has been a fantastic session and I really enjoyed it. And I've learned something new about the Army and customer success.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right.
Do I need